Today, I'm going to talk about cardio, and I will talk about cardio for fat loss, cardio for health, the interference effect, which is a big thing you should know if you're doing strength training and cardio, which most people probably should, because I think very few people should only do cardio. I think it's better for most people to do, as you'll see in the presentation, either a combination of strength training and cardio, or even only strength training. And then I'll sum up everything in terms of concrete applications. Like if you have one of these goals, or if you're an athlete, or you just want better health, how do you implement cardio in the best way possible? So let's start with cardio for fat loss. Probably the reason most people do cardio, otherwise they typically call it endurance training. Cardio helps you lose fat, or it can help you lose fat, but the first thing you should know about cardio is that it doesn't directly burn fat off your body. So many people have this idea that if you do cardio, you just do enough cardio, you get lean. But the effect of cardio is entirely mediated by the calories it burns. So cardio does not make you lose body fat, it burns calories. And as long as you're still consuming more calories than you're expending, your body will not lose any energy. That's physical law. There's a certain amount of energy in your body, and there's a certain amount that comes in. And if there is more coming in than the body is expending, the body will have to store some of that energy. And that typically happens in the form of either muscle or fat. And vice versa, if there is less energy coming in than the body is expending, the body will have to burn some of its own body mass for energy to fuel to make up the difference. So regardless of whether you do cardio, the energy balance is in the end what determines if you get leaner or not, or at least if you're losing bodily energy. And normally, if everything is set up on your program, that should mean you're losing body fat. So fat loss is dictated by energy balance. You typically only lose fat if you end up in energy deficit or a greater energy deficit. Research also finds, because of this, that if you do more cardio or you eat less, as long as it's the same amount of energy, so let's say you eat 500 calories less, or you do 500 calories worth of energy expenditure of cardio, you get the same end result. So it's very important to know, because you're always faced with the trade-off: will I eat less or do more cardio? You get the same end result. Now, this has a few important implications for how we implement cardio. And one of those is that a few of the strategies that are commonly purported to make cardio more effective probably are things you don't really need to worry about. So one of those is the fat burning myth, or the fat burning zone myth. So the idea of the fat burning zone is, which is true, the idea is true that if you exercise at a lower exercise intensity, as you can see in the graph here, so a lower percentage of maximal uptake, you can think of that simply as how hard you're training. If you're not training very hard, not near your maximum, then you can see that a higher relative proportion of your energy expenditure is fueled by fatty acids. That's not directly body fat, it's fatty acids floating in the bloodstream. But the idea is that you're burning more fat, and therefore you lose more fat. However, if you're exercising at a higher intensity, you burn more glycogen, relatively speaking. But if you're burning more glycogen now, in the end, it all comes back to energy balance, because if you're burning more glycogen now, that means you have to expend less energy, or you have to expend more energy later to resynthesize that glycogen, because your body cannot run out of glycogen, then it can no longer move. So if you're only burning fat, you're not burning glycogen, and you don't have to expend energy later resynthesizing the glycogen. So whether you're burning the fatty acids from your blood, or glucose from blood, or it comes mostly from glycogen in your muscles, or even, as you can see here, muscle triglycerides, which is also, there's actually fat in muscle tissue, and that's also a source of energy. It doesn't really matter in the end. So it all comes back to energy balance, because as I said, you burn more fat, that means you burn less glucose, which means there's less glycogen resynthesis later, and there's less fat burning later. And accordingly, research finds that high and low intensity cardio result in the same fat loss. So as long as it's the same energy expenditure, you get the same results. Now, a similar principle holds for fasted cardio. If you do fasted cardio, the idea is that because you haven't eaten yet, all of the energy that you burn comes from your body. And then typically, especially if you do low intensity cardio, that's mostly fat. So you rely primarily on your body fat stores to fuel the cardio session. However, if you're expending, say, 500 calories of energy from your body, and later you eat 500 calories, you gain it back. Whereas if you first eat 500 calories, and then you burn off those 500 calories, you're in the same position, right? So in the end, accordingly, research finds that given the same energy expenditure and energy intake, fasted and fat cardio result in the same amount of fat loss. So basically, cardio is only effective as a means to get us to our target energy balance or target energy deficit. If we want to lose fat, then it's really important to know how many calories does cardio burn. Now, I'm going to show you quite some numbers here, but I'll summarize it. So you have also some concrete rules of thumb that you can use. A good study on this, which I think is very telling, is by Falco and al. In 2015. And here you have to keep in mind that HRS, which is a bit of a weird abbreviation, is basically circuit strength training, circuit resistance training. And as you can see in the graph here, basically they found that whether you're doing treadmill running or bicycle riding, this was, I think, 30 minutes, relatively intensive, but steady intensity, cycling or treadmill running, or weight training, the energy expenditure is pretty much the same. Like there aren't really considerable differences. And in fact, based on this study, if you're really doing exercise purely for the sake of expending a lot of calories, then circuit training would actually be your best bet, which makes sense because circuit training is strength training basically without rest periods. You're doing one set, running to the next device, doing another set. For example, you do a set of leg curls, then you do a set of squats, then immediately after you do a set of push-ups, then immediately after you do a set of pull-ups. That would be a circuit. And it's very high intensity and you're constantly active. So in the sense of energy expenditure, it's sort of the best of both worlds. And it's also good to realize that you can do high intensity training and those kind of things, Tabata sprints, but you can do all of those things with weights as well. Now, you also have to realize that this energy expenditure, because here you're looking at about 10 calories per minute, which is pretty significant. If you weigh 100 kilos, that's 100. Yeah, this is 10 calories, so it's not even relative to body weight. But that means that even over 10 minutes, you're already at 100 calories. So it may seem like a lot. And if you're on a treadmill or any device, then it will give you some numbers on how many calories you burn. And those are A, typically gross overestimates, unfortunately. And B, they are not above basal. So you always have to realize that if you're adding a source of energy expenditure, you're not just adding the total, because that's the total amount of energy that you burn during that time. However, if you had not done that hour of cardio, you would have still burned calories, right? It's not like your body burns 0 calories from say 3 to 4 p.m., which is your normal workout hour. Even if you're sitting on the couch, you are burning about 1/24 of your resting energy expenditure. So you have to subtract that if you want to get your net extra energy expenditure. So just as an example, if you're burning 500 calories per hour with cardio, and 100 of those, 100 is probably quite a lot, but 100 of those you would burn anyway, you are adding 400, 500 minus 100 is 400 calories of energy expenditure to your day. So the total energy expenditures you see in exercise and any numbers that you read in magazines, you always have to discount those a little bit because of the alternative amount of calories. You can basically, if you're familiar with economics, this would be the opportunity cost of cardio. Now, here's a table with a lot of numbers, and they give energy expenditures for lots of different forms of cardio: cycling, jogging, walking, rowing, for men and women. Typically, the differences between men and women are not super large, but it depends a bit on which study you look at. So I've put them both here. And you can see that as a very rough rule of thumb, you get about 0.1 calories per kilogram per minute of energy expenditure. That typically holds well if you're doing something sustainable, something you can do for an hour, anything steady or relatively low intensity. And that happens to be pretty much exactly the energy expenditure of a typical strength training workout. So if you're not doing circuit training and you're not specifically exercising to burn more calories, you're just doing a normal strength training workout with free weights or any kind of bodybuilding or powerlifting routine, probably more bodybuilding. Powerlifters do 1 rep and then 5 minutes rest sometimes. You're getting about the same energy expenditure. And if you really crank up the intensity, you start doing things like CrossFit with low rest periods or circuit training, or as you can see here, high intensity rowing, basically things that you cannot sustain for a long period, then you can creep up to about 0.2 calories per kilogram per minute. And if you do the math here, you'll see that it's actually quite significant. Typically, you'll range from 200 to 600 calories with normal kind of workouts, but in extreme cases, you can get more, especially if you're a big guy or a big girl and you do a long duration of very intensive exercise, then you can actually get 1,000 plus, but that's quite rare. You don't often see net increases in energy expenditure over 600 of anything that you can do sustainably in your program. So rough rule of thumb, 0.1 to 0.2 calories per kilogram per minute. Now, I've also put here a list of exercise expenditures in endurance trained individuals. For the athletes, for example, if you're an athlete and you're watching this, you have to implement cardio. This is a good rule of thumb. You're typically looking closer at the 0.2 because A, endurance trainees can sustain higher intensities for longer, and B, their total work output is simply much higher. Just like if you're stronger in the gym, your total work output also increases. Work is weights times sets times reps. So the stronger you are, the higher the weight, or the more force you can produce on a bicycle, or well, you can run faster, you expend more energy. So it's also good to realize that if you are very endurance trained, you can probably go closer to the 0.2 calories per kilogram per minute. But even then, you see that it's quite rare to go over that. And the only one here was basically relatively high intensity. It's called moderate, but it was 84% aerobic. Rowing could still go up to 0.3, but all the other studies found, even with CrossFit, you don't really reach those numbers. So those provide some useful rules of thumb on how to estimate your energy expenditure based on what you're doing. You also have to add to that energy expenditure a bit of EPOC, a bit of excess post-exercise oxygen consumption. So what this means is that after your workout finishes, or after you stop exercising in general, your energy expenditure is going to continue to be higher than it was before. So it's not just that you're exercising, you burn more calories, then it stops. But after you stop exercising, energy expenditure continues to be elevated, sometimes for 72 hours or perhaps even longer. Research after 72 hours is scarce. Now, this sounds quite impressive in terms of the duration of excess oxygen consumption. Hold on, let me see. All right, I get some messages, but we can answer questions after the lecture. Then I can go into all of your questions, don't worry. But basically, this afterburn effect may sound significant if you look at how long it lasts. And you can also see that it's higher with higher intensity work. However, if you convert the actual amount of oxygen consumption to calories, you're looking at not so impressive numbers. For example, this study found that even if you do strength training, resistance training, with 50 to 60 total sets, a very intensive workout, you're looking at only 114 total calories of afterburn. And even with high intensity interval training, like the Bata sprints and the like, it's generally below 100 calories worth of energy expenditure. So this in practice is what you can often do is just ignore this extra epoch and then pretend that the energy expenditure was above basal. And then that roughly cancels out. So that greatly simplifies things. You basically ignore the afterburn of energy expenditure, and you also ignore the fact that your net or your energy expenditure during the workout was not above basal. And then what you simply do is, if you burn 500 calories during the workout, you just add 500 calories to your program, or you assume that you're in 500 calories greater deficit. And that roughly balances out. But then if you want to be super strict and meticulous, then typically assume that the strength training workout or something has 80 calories, 50 to 80 calories of epoch, and also subtract basal energy expenditure. So in conclusion, what does this mean in terms of practical implications? Well, it means that the overall energy expenditure of any type of cardio that you do is quite similar to resistance training in practice, if it's a sustainable intensity. You're looking at 200 to 600 calories per hour typically. And what that means is that you can typically maximize the time you invest in resistance training before you add cardio. And that's a huge implication, right? Because if your time is limited in the week, and you say you have 4 hours in the week that you devote to exercise and you want to lose fat, how do you divide this time? Well, based on this, because you're getting a similar amount of energy expenditure anyway, and cardio doesn't do much more than that, you want to devote this time to strength training. And only after you've maximized your strength training time, because there's only so much strength training you can do productively. Maybe you don't want to gain more muscle, or maybe you're simply at your maximum recoverable volume, as Mike Isvertel, another speaker here, would call it. Then you can consider adding cardio. But before that, most people, unless you really don't want to build any muscle, should probably do strength training before they add more cardio, because you get all the benefits of strength training, muscle growth, strength development, etc. And the energy expenditure is not very different. So when you've already maximized your strength training time, cardio may still actually not have much effect on energy expenditure anymore as you think, because energy expenditure is constrained. So if you're, for example, looking at a competitor, bikini competitor that's already strength training every single day, and at say 1,500 calories a day, and they have a tough time decreasing their energy intake even more because appetite is a big problem. At that point, you may want to add cardio. Better to add cardio than to eat even less. However, you may run into the problem that you're actually not going to expend that much more energy. And this is something that the last few years of research have really looked at. Maximal energy expenditure is constrained. So the human body seems to have a limit to how much energy expenditure it can handle / wants to handle, because part of this is a functional conservation of energy. It's not, once you get to about 2.5 times BMR, basal metabolic rate, of total energy expenditure, it seems that certain digestive processes and metabolic processes actually become limiting factors. But before that, it's mostly a decrease in your body's a neural adaptation that makes you basically more lazy. And this is also what many people can experience themselves. For example, if you do strength training and an hour of cardio on the same day, and especially if you're in contest prep, after the cardio session, you come home, you plump down on the couch, and you're just exhausted. You don't move anymore, and that registers as a lower energy expenditure. So this is basically how you can sort of sense this process. So like I said, the maximum metabolic scope or maximum energy expenditure seems to be about 2.5 times BMR, which is quite a lot. And you typically don't get there unless you have a really high activity level. But before that, you also start seeing some effects. And here's a visual to illustrate what this means. It means that on a simple, what you might expect, simply the more activity you do on the left, the additive model basically would say that the more active you are, the more energy you burn. However, what we see in practice is that energy expenditure seems to be constrained. So up to a certain point, more physical activity means more energy expenditure. However, at some point, if you do more physical activity, it has only a marginal further effect on energy expenditure, because your other physical activity level, like your daily life, movements, what I'm doing with my hands now, just walking around when you're thinking, for example, or just bobbing your head, listening to music, what we call non-exercise activity thermogenesis, also called SPA, spontaneous physical activity. We see decreases in those things, much like if you're getting very lean, very similar to adaptive thermogenesis. So what does this mean for cardio? Well, aerobic exercise, which is cardio typically, causes a significant reduction in these things that I said, SPA and HEAT. So exercise or movements that you're not really consciously aware of. And we see in some research, for example, that if you double the duration of cardio, so you go from, say, 30 minutes to an hour, or you go from 3 cardio sessions to 6 cardio sessions, this does not actually increase the energy deficit and the amount of fat loss we see in some research. And which is to say, energy expenditure is constrained. And this is, of course, a very annoying situation to end up in, because you're doing more work, spending more effort, but you're not actually getting more energy expenditure. And accordingly, we actually see that aerobic exercise alone, so you're only doing, say, cardio, or you're adding cardio to a diet, does not improve fat loss at all in many studies, and even 2 meta-analyses, showing that overall in the literature, there's pretty much no fat loss. So if you just get the average individual, and you have them do cardio, then they barely lose any fat at all. So it varies a bit per individual. Some people are much more susceptible to this than others. And the main dividing line seems to be that people with a low physical activity level benefit the most. And the higher your physical activity level already is, whether that's via strength training, or you're just very active, or you have a more than 10K step count per day, those scenarios, people typically don't see much effect anymore from adding cardio or just increasing their physical activity level in other ways. And this brings us back to some more reasons to prioritize strength training over cardio, because strength training does not seem to suffer much, if at all, from constrained energy expenditure. It seems that at a certain stress to the body can basically not ignore it, and it has limited adaptation to it. So it seems in general that the body adapts more to things that are constant stresses over a long time, compared to like a strength training session, which is, if your normal stress is this, a strength training is a huge spike in stress and then it stops. The body does not seem to adapt as much to that compared to a constantly high physical activity level, which allows the nervous system to adapt to that level of activity and compensate for it. Strength training is also more appetite suppressing than cardio. So training with weights, like bodybuilding style, or just general weight training, is actually better to suppress your appetite than cardio. And a lot of people think that exercise makes them hungry, but usually what the case is that this is a circadian rhythm effect, in that they're used to eating after their workouts, therefore the body becomes hungry at that time. But they're actually not, you can quite reliably see in research that almost any form of exercise is appetite suppressive. So if you just calculate someone's total daily energy intake, they typically end up eating less when they've done a form of exercise on that day. One exception, which we'll get to later, may be swimming. Strength training also increases our basal metabolic rate, primarily by increasing our total amount of lean body mass and muscle growth, and cardio basically does not. So with strength training, you're also investing in a lifelong of higher energy expenditure, whereas with cardio, it's basically a single investment. You get a single amount of energy expenditure, and thereafter it's done. And then if you account for these factors, it's not surprising that on a time-equated basis, so say you're doing 4 hours of exercise in ad libitum dieting settings, so people are not strictly tracking and monitoring their calories with a target intake, they're just eating until they're full. And we see that strength training is more effective than cardio, and even more effective than a combination of strength training and cardio for fat loss, based on a meta-analysis, so quite a lot of research. And that's, again, a huge finding, right? Because it means that if your primary goal is fat loss, then strength training is simply better. Like, it's flat out better up until at least a certain point of time invested in exercise. So if you have a client or yourself with, say, 3 hours of exercise per week, and their primary goal is fat loss, you should pretty much still not do any cardio. It should only be strength training. You actually get the best effect, not just for fat loss, but also for other benefits, except perhaps all health benefits, which brings us to our next topic, cardio for health. What if you're doing your cardio not specifically or only to lose fat, but you're also doing it in large part, or maybe only even because of longevity, or you want to just feel better? Well, for this, the question is, do you need cardio? Because we see that for fat loss, actually, strength training seems to win out, at least until you're doing a very high level of exercise already. It seems best to first prioritize strength training, and only thereafter, if you're already doing, say, 4 hours of strength training, thereafter you can think about, am I going to add some cardio, or can I do even more strength training? For health, the considerations are a little bit different, but we see that, again, on a time-equated basis in limited dieting settings. So say 4 hours of exercise per week, and people just eat until they're hungry. Then strength training, just like for fat loss, is more effective than cardio, or a combination of the two, for the improvement of many health biomarkers. Again, this is the same meta-analytic research. So again, this means that most people should prioritize strength training for the first few hours of exercise per week. And that's because, again, you get with cardio, you get some cardiovascular adaptations, but the start of those, especially in beginners, you also get with squatting for high reps, for example, and just general strength training. If you do strength training, you already get a decent amount of endurance. I know that a lot of guys sometimes, or clients sometimes ask me, like, I feel that I'm neglecting my endurance by only doing strength training. And of course, if you want great endurance, you should do endurance training. But a strength trainee or bodybuilder or powerlifter will still have much better endurance than an untrained individual. Like, it's very important to realize that. So you already get quite some of those adaptations. And we'll also get into in a bit, actually, that it's very important to see that in a beginner, these adaptations are actually quite similar. And it's only in very trained individuals that we see clear divergence in how the body adapts to strength training versus cardio. Now, you get a lot of the same benefits with strength training. Like, it's anti-inflammatory, it's anti-diabetic, it's very anti-diabetic, but not all of them. Like, it's definitely the case that endurance training offers some unique benefits. And overall, probably, at least if you're looking at the long term and you're adding, you're already doing a bit of both, then cardio is arguably healthier in a sense. Although, again, it's hard to say, because fat loss, which strength training is more effective for, is actually one of the most important things you can do for your health. With fat loss, almost any health biomarker improves. Like you see, typically someone's cholesterol profile improves, their heart rate goes down, their fasting glucose levels go down, insulin sensitivity increases, almost any marker of inflammation will decrease. Fat loss is really, really, really good for your health. So to the extent that things are healthy, a lot of that is actually mediated by helping you to get lean. And again, strength training up to until the first few hours of exercise actually seems to be better in that regard. However, even then, there are some things that strength training does not seem to do much. Strength training seems to have very little effect on your risk of cancer, for example. And it also doesn't seem to have the same anti-aging effects that cardio has. So over the very long term, there are definitely health reasons to incorporate cardio. And indeed, we see that in meta-analytic research, it's a combination of research studies. So if you have a lot of different studies, you can meta-analyze them, put all of those studies together and see what the total literature says. We see that aerobic and anaerobic exercise, or generally strength training and cardio, you have independent positive effects on all-cause mortality. So if you want the lowest chance of dying, all-cause mortality is you're basically the ability to die from all causes, or the chance that you die from any cause. You get the lowest of that, the best health, best longevity, most chance of surviving, if you're doing strength training and cardio. However, most research finds that there are very strong diminishing returns to any type of exercise after a few hours per week. And we see quite consistently detrimental effects of ultra endurance training. So as people that are as fit freaks, myself included, it's very easy to think that more is always better. And the more exercise you do, the healthier you are. But it doesn't seem to be the case. There is basically, you can only get so healthy. And once you're lean, you have a decent amount of muscle mass, you have a bit of endurance, you have above average strength levels, you know, getting even more of those things may not really matter. Like you only need so much insulin sensitivity, for example, to handle any amount of glucose that comes in from your diet. And then being even more insulin sensitive doesn't really matter. You also get diminishing effects. For example, if you have a strong family history of cancer or heart disease, then it's quite likely that that's going to kill you. And then, for example, you can minimize the risk of diabetes to 1 in 12 trillion, but it doesn't matter because you're still going to die of something else, right? So overall, it's really questionable, and we don't really have research on this. If you're already lean, you already have a decent amount of muscle mass, you're already doing strength training, and if you then add cardio, are you going to get even healthier? Is it still beneficial? Or, does it not really matter anymore? It's very questionable. So for health, it's still a bit of a debate. Probably I'd say that if health is really your primary consideration, you should do both, based on the fact that they have independent effects. But it's not like you're majorly missing out, probably, if you're not doing cardio. And this is well illustrated by this study by Stansfeld, pretty recent. It was a 5-year randomized control trial, which we don't see very often. They found no reduction in all-cause mortality in elderly subjects that were physically active, and when they added 2 cardio sessions per week, and it didn't matter whether that was low-intensity steady state training, LISS, or HIIT, like high-intensity interval training. Neither group had a significant reduction in their death rate compared to people that didn't have any cardio. So, it goes to show that you really have to look at whether you're absolutely maximizing and optimizing your health versus just getting to a really good level of health. There is a huge difference probably in what you have to do to get to either scenario. Now, another factor that you have to be aware of with cardio, because like I said, you probably have to do strength training and cardio. Almost anyone, unless you're really opposed to adding any amount of muscle mass, should do a combination. Any type of athlete pretty much should do a combination. Any person that's interested in just getting toned or optimizing their physique, bodybuilding, any type of athletic sport should do either both or just strength training. Now, if you're doing both, then you have to be aware that there is an interference effect between these two. And you've probably seen images like this that you see on the screen now, that strength and endurance training result in very different physiques, very different looking individuals. And that's because endurance and strength training stimulate very different adaptations. And when you do both together, you get what's called a concurrent training effect, also called an interference effect. And this means that these 2 types of training that you're doing, they compete, they interfere with each other, because it's like pulling your body into 2 different directions. On the one hand, you're telling it, I want better endurance, like I want to produce force for a longer period of time, I want my body to be more conservative with energy expenditure. And on the other hand, you're telling it, I want to get bigger, I want to expend more energy, I want to produce more force now. It doesn't matter if that comes at the cost of greater energy expenditure, right? It's a little bit of a mixed signal for your body. And you can see here, generally speaking, that endurance and strength training stimulate very different adaptations. So what endurance training normally does is the primary adaptations you get are an increase in VO2 max. So your oxygen consumption potential increases, your lungs become stronger, your resting heart rate becomes lower, ventilatory threshold improves, your work economy improves. Basically, your body becomes more efficient at delivering blood and oxygen and energy to your muscles to keep them working for longer. And with strength training, you see that muscle cross-sectional area increases and force production increases. So the muscle gets bigger and it can produce more force. It becomes stronger, bigger and stronger. And the primary mechanism for endurance training is substrate depletion. So there is a low amount of energy availability. You're burning a lot of fat, you're losing a lot of energy from your body. The body registers that and tries to prevent you from running out of fuel, basically. And with strength training, we see that the primary stimulus is myofiber disruption. So it's mechanical tension on the muscle fibers, and this disrupts the muscle fibers and causes them to adapt to become stronger and resist that tension better. And this is more for the geeks, but the primary gene transcription pathways activated are AMPK, the AMPK cascade for endurance training, and for strength training is the ACT or mTOR or P70S6K1 cascade. And then if you look at what's really being built by the body, you see that for strength training, many people are aware of this, it's myofibers, so contractile proteins. Basically, your muscle actually gets bigger. You're adding protein, slamming more protein onto the muscle, making it bigger. And with endurance training, you're building, you're actually getting mitochondrial and sarcoplasmic protein synthesis. Many people are aware of muscle protein synthesis and myofibrillar protein synthesis, but there is also the creation of new proteins in your mitochondria, which are your cell's energy production centers, like your little nuclear plants that provide energy. And there is also sarcoplasmic protein synthesis, which is basically the fluid around the muscle. And there's also more of that with endurance training, which does not necessarily mean sarcoplasmic muscle growth, by the way, but that's a different topic. Now, because these stresses and these adaptation processes are so different, we see that if you do both at the same time, they can compete with each other. And here is in more detail than you really need to know. You can see which of these signaling cascades and which of these pathways seem to conflict with each other. So in this image, an arrow means it stimulates, and a blunted arrow without the head, means it blunts, it reduces. And you can see that if you're getting high energy depletion, and you're also getting high tension in your muscle fibers, you get a stress for an endurance and a strength stress. And these block each other's pathways. So basically these mechanisms, the mechanisms for this interference are AMPK signaling, SIRT1 signaling, protein catabolism, like you're also just burning protein and oxidizing protein in the body when you're doing cardio. And there also seems to be suppression of satellite cell activity, which is needed for muscle repair. And there might be CNS fatigue, which is still a little contentious, but it would explain why some of the interference effect, as we'll get to in a bit, is actually central, which means that it's not just for muscles that you're doing both types of exercise for, but there's actually research showing that if you do bicycling, for example, or jogging, that limits your biceps growth. And I'll show a study on that in a bit. Key point in any case is that if you do both, if you're adding endurance training to a resistance training program, it reduces muscle growth and strength development compared to doing resistance training alone. And the amount of endurance adaptation seems to depend on how endurance trained you already are. But basically, if you're doing different stresses and you're doing both, you're getting sort of a mixture between the two. You're not getting the full of both, you're getting an in-between adaptation. Now, it's very important to realize this is endurance effect, this concurrent training effect, is only occurs for actual endurance training or cardio. It's not just when you're walking to the gym. So you don't have to be afraid that any type of activity that you do, any energy expenditure is going to make your muscles fall off. It's only when there is an actual significant endurance stress on your body, and especially when it's overlapping with the stress for muscle growth, that you get this interference. So anything that does not pose a stress for your body will not cause an interference effect. So some people go completely paranoid with the interference effect and think, oh, you know, I shouldn't move too much because of my gains, but you don't have to worry about that. You are very rarely, if ever, going to get an interference effect by accident. If you're not doing specific cardio or endurance training, it's unlikely you're going to get an interference effect. Now, it's also important to realize, and some people say there is no interference because of this, is that untrained individuals can still gain muscle from cardio. However, this is pretty much gone in about 5 weeks. You know, you don't build a lot of muscle with cardio, which is why you see that marathon runners and the like are not jacked. And this is also why, if you look at studies in untrained individuals, sometimes you don't see any endurance effect or interference effect. And then people say, well, look, the interference effect is actually not so well established. But I'd say it very much is. It's just that in untrained individuals, they gain muscle from anything. In fact, there's a very old review paper that concluded that strength training is actually not more effective than cardio for muscle growth. And that's because they only looked at untrained individuals of study durations, I think, up to 5 weeks. So, if your baseline is no activity whatsoever, then any activity you do, any type of exercise that you do is going to build some muscle mass. But it's not going to be a lot. And if you keep doing that exercise, you're not going to just get bigger and bigger and bigger. So it's not really a surprise that some studies don't find an interference effect in untrained individuals. It should be more of a surprise that many studies already find an interference effect, even in untrained individuals. And accordingly, we see in research that it takes about 8 to 10 weeks before there's divergence of cellular signaling pathways and myofibrillar versus mitochondrial muscle protein synthesis. And at that point, we start reliably seeing that strength and muscle growth suffer. So you can actually see in studies in untrained individuals, the first 8 weeks or so, there doesn't appear to be any interference. But then in the next 8 weeks, there is interference. And the exact timeline can vary a bit per person. But overall, the conclusion is that these things may not be much of a factor in untrained individuals, but they definitely are for anyone past the novice level of training. So how do you prevent or reduce the interference effect? If you want to do cardio, for example, if you're an athlete, or you really need to do cardio to get lean, or you want to do cardio for optimal health, but you also want to do strength training, how can you do both and get the best of both worlds rather than some bad compromise? Well, the first thing to realize is that the interference effect scales with duration. The more cardio you do, the worse the interference. So take-home message there is do the minimum you need. So we know that there are strong diminishing returns for your health. And for fat loss, you only need to be in a certain amount of energy deficit. So don't do more than you need to get those kind of results. And what you can also do is you can spread it out. And this is probably one of the best things if you're not specifically interested in the endurance effects, the endurance adaptations. So if you're not an athlete, but you're doing it for fat loss, then you can spread out the cardio sessions, like pre and post workout, or even just random times of day, because then any session in itself will probably not cause an interference effect, but the total energy expenditure will be the same. So you get much worse interference by one long cardio session, like an hour of steady state cardio. Whereas if you do 6 times 10 minutes cardio, say every day 10 minutes, you're probably not going to have any interference from those sessions. So there will be basically no interference, you get the same energy expenditure. Now, the timing is also very important, probably the most important actually, especially for athletes. So the interference effect, like I said, it occurs only when there are overlapping anabolic windows or there's overlap in the signaling pathway. So when the body is adapting to both types of stress, endurance and strength at the same time. So basically, after any time you train, after the next days, there is an anabolic window, which is when protein synthesis is higher. And this is both for strength training and for endurance training. So it's just different proteins that are synthesized, but there is an anabolic window for both. When these anabolic windows overlap, then you get some issues. And it's especially when the acute signaling pathways overlap. Now, we see that the acute signaling of AMPK, for example, this dissipates mostly over just 3 hours. And accordingly, we see that if you're performing your strength training 6 hours after a workout, after a cardio session, then that greatly reduces at least the interference effect. And if you're separating both by 24 hours, so you're doing them on different days, then there is much, much less interference still. So that's a really, really important message for concurrent athletes to not do both on the same day. And the worst is probably pre-workout, because if you do your cardio before your strength training, then it creates a lot of fatigue. So your strength training workout suffers a lot, and there is 100% overlap in your anabolic windows. So that's the absolute worst time you could do your cardio. Whereas if you have to do both in the same session, post-workout is better. And this is confirmed by a meta-analysis, because you get the strength training workout without the acute fatigue. So you can do your strength training workout as normal. And then afterwards, cardio does not suffer from doing strength training beforehand, because the stimulus for endurance training is substrate depletion. So you already have substrate depletion from the strength training workout, and then the cardio session just adds to that. So you can actually get a greater substrate depletion. However, there's still complete overlap. So again, it's better to separate them as much as possible. And what you can also do, again, if you're primarily interested in fat loss and not endurance training adaptations, you can do the cardio pre and post workout, spread it out so that neither cardio session is actually intensive enough to trigger interference. So basically you just do a 20-minute extended warm-up before your strength training workout, and then you do a 20-minute extended cool down after your strength training workout. And that should not cause any interference if it's not intensive, not fatiguing enough. So again, if you have to combine both in the same session, because it's a lot of commuting to the gym, for example, or you're going to practice, and just too much hassle, or just simply not available, maybe the stadium is not open, it's best to spread them out over pre and post workout. Intensity is another big one. So generally speaking, the more intensive a cardio workout is, the worse the interference, which makes sense, right? Because it's a greater stress. The greater the endurance training stress, the greater the interference it will have on your strength training. This means, unfortunately, that in most research, high-intensity interval training has equal or even worse interference compared to low-intensity steady-state training. And again, like I said, there are even indications that it might be worse. And that's because with low-intensity steady-state training, you can keep the intensity below the threshold of interference. Like a 20-minute walk, for example, is not going to cause interference, generally speaking. So, whereas high-intensity sprinting of any duration is probably going to induce some interference. Like it's always a stress. It's always stressful for your body. So, interestingly, women in particular seem to respond very poorly to sprint training. They seem to suffer greater fatigue and don't get as much muscle protein synthesis. So in general, there seems to be a trend, which is beyond the scope of this lecture, but there is a trend that women respond a bit more poorly to like super high intensity and explosive types of exercise, and they respond better to like low intensity steady state cardio, more higher rep training. They're also better at high reps, for example, at a given percentage of 1RM, at least below 80%. Women can typically do more reps than men. So there's a bit of a gender difference there. And with cardio, it's specifically relevant for sprinting. So what you want to do, ideally, especially for fat loss, is to keep the intensity under the threshold of endurance training. And a good rule of thumb here is you want to keep it below about 60% of your maximum heart rate, or you can still breathe for your nose. If you can still hold a conversation, or you can still read your favorite magazine while you're doing cardio, you know you're probably not getting interference effect. So that's also an indication for people that really don't train hard to begin with. You don't have to worry about these things if your idea of training hard is not being or barely being able to read your favorite magazine on the leg extension machine, right? So these are more advanced training concepts, especially for athletes and people that do more strength training. So you may be wondering, what about sprinters? Like if high intensity interval training is so bad, maybe even worse, like what explains the physiques of sprinters? Many sprinters have a great physique. And if you train like a sprinter, then you should look like a sprinter, right? That would be true, but you're not training like a sprinter if you're doing high intensity interval training. Like sprinters do not train Tabata style, like 20 minutes sprinted or 20 seconds sprinting, 10-second rest. Their program is actually a lot more like resistance training. So it's like 1 10-second sprint or even 5-second sprint and then 5 minutes rest. So the work rest ratio is completely different between sprinters and high intensity interval training. So metabolically speaking, if you look at what goes on in the body, which substrates are burned, etc., then Tabata style sprinting, like sprinting, a little bit of rest, sprinting, a little bit of rest, actually is a lot more like steady state cardio, metabolically speaking, than it is to strength training. So that type of interval training is nothing like strength training, and the body does not adapt to it any remotely similar way. So we can see that high intensity interval training does not build considerable muscle mass. It's very very little, and pretty much comparable to low intensity cardio. So it would be much more accurate to say that if you're doing this type of exercise, you're training like a soccer player and you will look like a soccer player. If you want to train like a sprinter, then you should mostly do strength training. And the sprinting they do is probably not the reason they're that muscular. It's their diet and their strength training. But the sprinting that they do is like 5 to 10 seconds often, especially for the 100-meter guys, which are most famous. And then lots and lots of rest. So it's not cardio-like at all. It's very explosive and oriented at maximal performance, not at endurance. The last way you can control the amount of damage that you do is by the modality, so the type of cardio. This also has a substantial impact on the interference that you cause. So somewhat ironically, jogging, which is probably the most popular form of cardio in the world, might actually also be the worst. Before we can explain that, you know that muscle growth is a mostly local process. So most research finds that if you train, whether you train legs or not, for example, does not influence your upper body growth. There is a little bit of research suggesting that maybe the increase in hormones might have a positive effect, but it's scanned and rejected by a lot of other research. So by and large, your biceps responds only to what goes on in the biceps. Cardio seems to be a bit of an exception because the interference effect is mostly local, but also has a systemic component, which again might be due to systemic CNS fatigue. So fatigue in the central nervous system, which limits muscle activation. But you can still minimize the interference effect by training non-priority muscle groups. So if you're, for example, you're a men's physique competitor and you wear trunks on stage, then your legs are not as important. So you can do, for example, bicycling as a great form of cardio. And if you're a bikini athlete, you can do upper body rowing or upper body ergometer work because your lower body is most important to make really muscular. And the upper body, you can do the cardio for that, and they don't have to, you know, those muscles don't have to be fully developed anyway. So it's good to realize and think of which muscles are you training with your cardio. You want to train the muscles that you care about the least, typically. Like I said, there are still some systemic interference. For example, a study by Kikuchi et al. Found that effect sizes for biceps growth and strength were over 30% lower with concurrent cycling and strength training. So even cycling, which is typically a form of cardio that has a relatively low interference effect, still can stimulate a significant interference effect, even in unrelated muscle groups in the upper body. Now, overall, like I said, cycling is actually a pretty good form of cardio. Running tends to induce more interference than bicycling. It's a little bit contentious. There are 2 meta-analyses showing it does and 1 showing it doesn't. It probably depends a bit on the type of cardio and everything, but it's quite likely that running is worse because it induces more muscle damage, which can reduce muscle activity in those muscle groups in the lower body, and it's high impact. So it's also more injurious, more stressful on connective tissues. So overall, most people probably, unless you're an athlete, you have to run, probably shouldn't be running, especially strength trainees that do a lot of strength training. Running can really increase your injury risk. In fact, many people fail to appreciate just how injurious running is. Like the injury rate of jogging is literally about 10 times as high, I think maybe even more, than strength training, because it's repeated high impact. It's not controlled movement. Like strength training is very controlled movement. There's nothing falling on you. You're not bludgeoning against some surface, and you're only doing a couple repetitions typically per set. So running is like the same impact constantly, and that's quite a risk for your soft tissues. Swimming, as I alluded to earlier, is also generally not a good cardio modality because cold water immersion, and most water that you swim in is relatively cold, stimulates your appetite. Cold in general seems to stimulate your appetite, but it's offset somewhat by increasing energy expenditure. But typically with swimming, it's not. So what you often see, and also a reason that swimmers typically are not as lean as, for example, sprinters or cyclists, is that you get hungry in contrast to most types of exercise after swimming. And many people experience this themselves as well. So if your primary, especially if your primary motivation is fat loss, and you're doing swimming to lose body fat, but you end up hungrier, then it defeats the purpose of the swimming, of course, because you could have just eaten less and had the same result. You'd also have been hungry. So, in summary, how can we reduce the interference effect? Now, the duration, you want the minimum needed and spread it out if possible. It's better to do a lot of short cardio sessions than one long one. In terms of timing, you want to separate the cardio and strength training as much as possible. This is especially really important for athletes. In terms of intensity, low intensity steady state is preferable because you can keep the intensity under the threshold of significant endurance adaptations. Whereas with high intensity interval training, you're always getting some interference, and the only question is how much. So in terms of modality, like how you do the cardio, probably best to do concentric only exercise like ergometers, bicycling. Rowing is mostly concentric. You do it for non-priority muscle groups. So like I said, ergometers are great, bicycling is great. Those are probably overall the best for most people. And running and swimming are generally not so good, unless you need to do them for your given sport. So overall, everything that we've learned so far about cardio for health, fat loss, and the interference effect, what does this all mean in terms of concretely how you implement cardio? Well, for fat loss, cardio should basically be a last resort. You implement before this time, you should almost always prioritize strength training. Like you get better fat loss up until the first few hours of exercise per week. You also get better improvement in many health biomarkers. And on top of that, you build an increase in your metabolic rate, you build muscle mass, etc. So cardio should basically be a last resort when you're already doing strength training. And you really don't want to lower your energy intake any further. Then you still have to consider, if you have to do cardio to get lean, how are you going to sustain this? Typically, the answer is more in sustainable lifestyle change via changes in food choices, typically. Because if you need, say, an hour of cardio a day to get lean, and you don't plan on doing an hour of cardio every day, how are you going to stay lean, right? So typically, for me, the only scenario where I reliably or somewhat regularly implement cardio is female athletes in contest prep. So bikini competitors, body fitness competitors, some figure competitors. And then the minimum duration needed to still lose fat, low intensity steady state training on a concentric only machine like an ergometer, and ideally on rest days, if you have any, which are then technically not rest days anymore, I guess. And again, spread it out, etc. So typically for pure fat loss, if you're not interested in health or concurrent training, I'm not a big fan of cardio, basically. For health, it's definitely more plausible that it's beneficial. You should still prioritize strength training if you're only doing a few hours of exercise per week, but probably add a little bit of low intensity steady state training on non-resistance training days. So a good general health scheme would maybe be 3 to 4 strength training workouts and then 1 to 2 cardio sessions on the other days. And then probably that was probably going to maximize overall health benefits and actually come pretty close to, or you get a very decent increase in muscle growth and strength development from that. So it's a good balanced package, if you will. For concurrent training, so if you're an athlete and you need to do both, the most important thing by far is to separate the endurance training and the resistance training. So many of the strategies that you have to reduce the interference effect you cannot employ because they work via decreasing the endurance training stimulus. And if you're an athlete, you want to build that muscular endurance. Endurance and strength are both important for you. So the only really good strategy you have to get the best of both worlds is to do them on different days, and you could even consider doing them in different blocks. Typically, endurance adaptations are much easier to build. So for example, if you're in the off season and you don't have to be on the field, or you don't compete at least for a couple months, then those months typically are best to focus on building muscle and strength. And then you can focus more on endurance in the weeks to months running up to your competition season. Of course, you still want to do a bit of maintenance work and stuff, but you can probably play around with block periodization in this case. So that should give you a good overall framework on how to implement cardio or how not to implement it based on your specific goals.